1954, Guatemala. A president came to power through a democratic election. He redistributed land to impoverished farmers. He reclaimed idle territory from a foreign corporation. He tried to run his country for his own people. 9 months later, he was in exile. You want to know what brought him down? Not a rival government, not a foreign army. A fruit company. Its name was the United Fruit Company. Its nickname was El Pulpo, the Octopus. And Guatemala was just one of them, one of dozens of countries wrapped inside its arms. Like this video, because what you're about to learn starts with a piece of fruit you've probably eaten this week. This is Silent Tab. The United Fruit Company was founded in Boston in 1899. Within 2 decades, it had buried itself into the heart of Central America. Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Colombia, Panama. Every country the same pattern. Acquire land, seize infrastructure, buy the government, extract profit. But nowhere ran deeper than Guatemala. Under dictator Jorge Ubico, the United Fruit Company took control of 42% of Guatemala's total land. The country's only functioning port, owned by the company. The entire railroad network, owned by the company. The telephone system, the telegraph lines. The company paid no taxes, no import duties. The Guatemalan government had almost no legal authority over it whatsoever. The company was not in Guatemala. The company was Guatemala. But here's the detail that matters. Of all that land, over 550,000 acres across Central America, only 15% was ever used. The rest was kept deliberately idle. No farming, no development, no competition. Independent farmers were barred from using UFC-owned rail lines. When the company abandoned a region, it tore up the tracks behind it, destroyed them, so no one else could benefit. For years, it lobbied against the construction of public roads. Because if people found alternative routes, the monopoly would crack. Workers received no cash wages. They were paid in coupons, valid only at company-owned stores. What the company stocked was what they could buy. Nothing else existed. El Pulpo, the octopus, its arms reached everything. In 1950, Guatemala experienced something it had never seen before. Jacobo Arbenz was elected president in a free and fair democratic vote, the first in the country's history. He was a reformist, a nationalist, not a communist. A soldier who had watched his country be hollowed out by foreign capital and decided that had to end. He looked at the numbers. The majority of Guatemala's population were landless peasants. Nearly half the country's arable land belonged to a single foreign company, and most of that land sat empty. In June 1952, he signed Decree 900, the Agrarian Reform Law. Uncultivated land would be expropriated and redistributed to landless families. 500,000 people would receive land, the most sweeping democratic reform in Guatemalan history. The United Fruit Company's idle acres were seized. The government offered compensation at market value. UFC refused. The problem, the detail the company could not escape, was that it had spent decades declaring that land at a far lower value on its own tax filings. The government used the company's own numbers. The legal ground was solid. It didn't matter. Washington was already running a different process. Allen Dulles was director of the CIA. He owned United Fruit Company stock. He was a former member of its board of trustees. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State. His law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, had represented UFC for years. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, UFC shareholder. The Director of International Security Affairs at the State Department, UFC shareholder. Eisenhower's personal secretary was the wife of UFC's own public relations director. This was not coincidence. The United Fruit Company spent $500,000 lobbying Washington, roughly $4.5 million in today's money. One objective: make Arbenz a communist. In a country of 3 million people, there were 4,000 registered communists. It didn't matter. In the Cold War, that word was a skeleton key. It opened every door. In 1953, the CIA formally authorized the operation. Codename PBSUCCESS. Budget over $2.7 million. One of its chief architects was E. Howard Hunt, the same Howard Hunt who would surface again 2 decades later in the Watergate scandal. He described the operation in his own words. What we wanted to do was to have a terror campaign, to terrify Arbenz particularly, much as the German Stuka bombers terrified the population of Holland, Belgium, and Poland. That was the plan. Not a war, terror. A CIA-trained exile army of 500 men crossed the Honduran border in June 1954. CIA aircraft bombed the capital, and then, most effectively, fake radio broadcasts. Stations mimicking official Guatemalan state radio, announcing the army had collapsed, the government had fled, that it was all over. None of it was true. It worked anyway. Arbenz resigned. He fled the country. The years that followed brought exile, alcohol, and a death recorded as an accident in 1971. The CIA's chosen successor was Carlos Castillo Armas. His first act in power, the land reform, was canceled. Every acre returned to the United Fruit Company. Then came the war. Decades of civil conflict. The UN-backed Truth Commission reached its conclusion. 200,000 civilians dead. The majority were indigenous Maya communities. Massacres, forced disappearances, mass graves scattered across a country that had once, briefly, tried democracy. The migration waves flowing from Central America into the United States today, they trace back here. The roots of what is now framed as a border crisis were planted in June 1954, when a fruit company and 2 brothers dismantled a functioning government. In 1997, the CIA partially declassified the PBSUCCESS files. In 1999, President Clinton issued a formal apology for U.S. involvement in Guatemala. And the company? The United Fruit Company still exists. It trades today under the name Chiquita Brands International. In 2007, it admitted to funneling over $1.7 million to the AUC, a right-wing paramilitary terrorist organization in Colombia. It pleaded guilty to a federal crime, paid a $25 million fine. In 2024, a Florida jury ordered Chiquita to pay an additional $38.3 million to the families of victims whose deaths the company's money had helped finance. The methods evolved. The logic didn't. Think about what happened after 1954. 200,000 dead. A democracy erased. A generation of displacement. And the company that set it in motion went on to fund death squads in another country 60 years later, and is still selling bananas. Now consider this. January 2026. The Trump administration launched a military intervention in Venezuela. The official framing: national security. But Trump said it himself at his own press conference: oil. Nicolas Maduro was arrested. Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and ExxonMobil executives were summoned to the White House. Venezuelan oil revenues began flowing into U.S. Treasury accounts. Historians immediately drew the comparison, not as a metaphor, as a direct line. In 1954, it was a fruit company. In 2026, it's oil companies. The resource changed. The country changed. The template never did. Do you want us to cover Venezuela next? Drop it in the comments. This was Silent Tab. Until next time, stay awake.